This is TBK's Truth Frame, revealing the echoes of history across our world. When the West found Ceylon, Part 1, 1505 to 1550, the first fracture. A storm that changed a world. In the final months of 1505, the monsoon winds over the Indian Ocean rose like a living beast. Waves towered, clouds split open, and a Portuguese fleet, led by Dom Lourenço de Almeida, son of the Viceroy of India, was hurled violently off its intended course. They were not seeking new lands, they were hunting Moorish trading ships, the Muslim merchants who dominated the spice routes of the Indian Ocean. But fate had other plans. When the storm cleared, the sailors saw a coastline they did not recognize, lush, green, and crowned with mountains. They had stumbled upon Ceylon, the island known to the world for the finest cinnamon ever grown. This accident would ignite a chain of events that would fracture kingdoms, redraw faiths, and open the door to 443 years of European domination. The Kingdom of Kotte and the Visitors from the Sea. A fractured island. In 1505, Ceylon was divided into multiple kingdoms. Kotte, ruled by King Parakrama Bahu VIII, was the wealthiest and most politically influential. Kandy and Jaffna stood as independent powers, each with its own ambitions and rivalries. The island was already under pressure, from Arab Muslim traders in the west and Mughal influence from the east. The kings of Ceylon were even paying kapam, tribute, to China for protection. Into this fragile balance walked the Portuguese. The exact picture, what really happened in 1505. When Dom Lourenço de Almeida's fleet reached Ceylon in 1505, the people of the western coast had never seen Europeans before. They had never seen white-skinned men, metal armor, cannons, muskets, gunpowder. Ships of that size. To the villagers who first encountered them, the Portuguese were otherworldly. They drink blood, the origin. This part of the story comes from a real cultural misunderstanding. The Portuguese drank red wine. To the locals, who had never seen wine before, it looked like blood. When they saw the Portuguese drinking it from cups, the message carried to the king was, "They drink blood." This was not metaphor. It was literal confusion. They smoke fire, the origin. This refers to gunpowder weapons. When the Portuguese fired muskets or small cannons as signals or demonstrations, the villagers saw fire, smoke, thunderous noise, metal balls ripping through trees. No weapon in Sri Lanka at the time produced anything like this. So the report to the king included, "They breathe fire. Fire comes from their mouths and hands." To villagers who had never seen Europeans, they looked inhuman, pale, armored, loud, and violent. So the messenger who ran to Kotte described them as Yako Wagi Manisu, devil-like men. This phrase appears in multiple later chronicles and oral traditions. The king's reaction, Parakramabahu VIII. When the king heard the report, he is said to have replied, "If they are devils, they will vanish. If they are men, they will come to us." This line appears in later retellings and is consistent with the king's calm, strategic personality. He did not panic. he waited. And the Portuguese came. The exact picture, in one scene. A terrified coastal messenger runs into the royal court of Cote, breathless, shaking, and covered in sea spray. He kneels before King Parakramabahu VIII and cries out, "Maharaja Thuma, strange beings have come from the sea, white as ash, armored like demons, breathing fire from tubes, and drinking blood from cups." The court erupts in fear. The king remains silent. A new chapter of Sri Lankan history has begun. The first landing. Dom Lorenzo's fleet anchored first at Gal, then sailed north to Colombo, where they erected a stone pillar, a pedreo, carved with the royal arms of Portugal, to mark their arrival and their claim. The Portuguese approached the king of Cote with gifts, diplomacy, and a promise of trade. But beneath the courtesy lay a hunger for cinnamon, wealth, and empire. Parakramabahu VIII, facing internal threats and external pressures, agreed to a treaty. The Portuguese were granted permission to trade cinnamon, the island's most precious export, and soon built a small factory to process it. The door had opened. The fort that should never have been built. 1518, the first fortification. In 1518, the Portuguese returned, not as traders, but as occupiers. The viceroy Lopo Soares de Albergaria arrived with a large fleet and began constructing a triangular fort in Colombo, named Nossa Senhora das Virtudes, also known as Santa Barbara. This was no trading post. It was a foothold. A declaration. A warning. A strategic mistake. In 1524, the Portuguese dismantled the fort and withdrew, leaving only an agent under the protection of the King of Cote. They believed they could control the cinnamon trade without a military presence. They were wrong. The Muslim merchants, longtime rivals, moved quickly to reclaim their influence in Cote. The Portuguese, realizing their error, returned with force. Battles erupted across the western coast, culminating in decisive Portuguese victories at Vedalai, 1538, and Negombo, 1539. The cinnamon trade was now theirs. The kingdoms begin to bleed. The rise of Sitawaka and the Wijayaba Kalea. The Portuguese presence deepened the political fractures within the island. The Wijayaba Kalea, a violent internal uprising, tore through the kingdom of Cote and reshaped its leadership. The Portuguese exploited these divisions masterfully, inserting themselves into succession disputes and offering military support in exchange for influence. The religious front. With cinnamon secured, the Portuguese turned to souls. Missionaries, Jesuits and Franciscans, began converting coastal communities, especially the fishing castes. Churches rose along the western shores, and Catholicism began its long, complex entanglement with Sri Lankan identity. Bible in one hand, land in the other, what this story really means. Sri Lankans often say, they came with the Bible in one hand. While we were looking at the Bible, they took our land. This is not a single documented event. It is a cultural memory describing how religion and empire worked together. To understand it, we need to look at three layers. The missionaries' arrival was not innocent. Franciscans, from 1543. They were the first major missionary order in Sri Lanka. They built churches, schools, and began conversions, especially in coastal areas under Portuguese control. Jesuits, from 1602. They arrived later, highly educated, strategic, and deeply tied to Portuguese imperial policy. Why people felt suspicious. Missionaries always arrived after Portuguese military victories. They built churches inside or next to forts. Conversion often came with economic incentives, jobs, protection, food, or tax relief. Those who converted were treated as friends of the Portuguese, creating divisions in villages. So even though missionaries preached love and salvation, villagers saw them as part of a larger system. Land loss happened through the crown, not the Bible, but the two worked together. The Portuguese crown used a policy called padroado, meaning the king controlled the church, and the church served the king. This meant missionaries baptized villagers. Baptized villagers were considered subjects of the Portuguese crown. The crown then claimed the right to administer their lands. Lands of those who resisted were seized as rebellious or pagan. So the metaphor is accurate. The Bible distracted. The crown extracted. Missionaries didn't physically grab land, but their presence legitimized Portuguese authority. Forced conversions and social pressure created trauma. Many Sri Lankans remember stories like villagers forced to attend catechism, children taken to mission schools and raised Christian, Buddhist and Hindu temples destroyed or converted into churches, local chiefs losing land if they refused baptism, entire fishing communities converted under pressure. These memories passed down through generations. It's not about a single moment. It's about a pattern. Why this story still resonates today? Because it expresses a deeper truth. Religion was used as a tool of empire. Spiritual language masked political control. Villagers trusted the missionaries and lost more than they expected. This is why the metaphor survives. While we were looking at the Bible, they took our land. It's a poetic way of saying we were disarmed by faith and colonized by power. But not all kingdoms welcomed this new faith. Kandy resisted fiercely. Sitawaka resisted violently. And Kotte, weakened by internal betrayal, leaned ever more heavily on Portuguese support. 1550, the turning of the tide. By 1550, the kingdom of Kotte was no longer the confident, wealthy state it had been in 1505. It was a kingdom caught in a vice. Sitawaka rising in rebellion. Kandy resisting conversion. Portuguese power growing with every passing year. The Portuguese had not yet claimed the island outright, but they had already planted the seeds of domination. Control of the cinnamon trade. Influence over royal succession. Military presence on the coast. Religious conversion campaigns. Manipulation of internal rivalries. The island was being reshaped, slowly but irrevocably. The fracture had begun. Portuguese forts in Ceylon. The only Portuguese fort built in Sri Lanka between 1505 and 1550 was the first Colombo fort, Nossa Senhora das Virtudes, in 1518. In 1505 to 1506, the Portuguese first landed at Colombo, built a wooden chapel and factory, not a fort. In 1518, the constructed Fort Nossa Senhora das Virtudes in Colombo. 1524 the fort was dismantled after siege. 1538 to 1539 Portuguese military victories at Vedalai and Negombo, no forts yet. Vedalai is the Old Portuguese name for Vadalay, also written Vedalai/Vedalai, a coastal village located on the western side of the Jaffna Peninsula, near present-day Valanai, Kates Island, in northern Sri Lanka. 1550, arrival of Viceroy Afonso de Noronha, military campaigns but no new forts built. All other major Portuguese forts in Sri Lanka were constructed after 1550. Why the Portuguese dismantled the Colombo fort in 1524. Growing military pressure from Sitawaka. The rise of King Mayadun of Sitawaka created a powerful anti-Portuguese force. Sitawaka's expansion threatened Portuguese positions around Colombo. The small triangular fort was too weak to withstand a major siege. The fort was poorly designed and hard to defend. The 1518 fort, Nossa Senhora das Virtudes, or Santa Barbara, was tiny, triangular, and built quickly. It had only 3 bastions and limited artillery. It was positioned on the Hook of Colombo, a narrow rocky point, easy to isolate and cut off. Political strategy: avoid provoking the King of Kotte. The Portuguese were still guests of the King of Kotte, who allowed them to trade cinnamon. A permanent stone fort was seen as a provocation and risked turning Kotte against them. By dismantling the fort, they maintained the alliance while keeping a trading presence. Economic logic: the fort was too costly to maintain. The Portuguese were overstretched across the Indian Ocean. Colombo was not yet a major administrative center, only a cinnamon trading post. Maintaining a garrison, supplies, and artillery for a small, isolated fort was not worth the expense. Muslim merchant resistance made the area volatile. The Mapala, Malabar Muslim, traders were trying to regain control of the cinnamon trade. Their influence in Kotte politics made Colombo a dangerous and contested zone. The Portuguese preferred to withdraw temporarily rather than fight a multi-front conflict. The shadow of 443 years. The events between 1505 and 1550 were not merely historical episodes. They were the opening act of a long colonial tragedy. From this first accidental landing, the Portuguese would entrench themselves deeper until the death of their Mapala of Kotte in 1597, when they claimed the kingdom outright. From there, the Dutch would come. Then the British. And Ceylon would not breathe free air again until 1948. This is part 1 of a story of storms, kingdoms, betrayal, and the first European footprint on the soil of Sri Lanka. In my next episode, let us revisit the events in Kotte from 1551 which eventually made the Europeans firmly entrench in the island. Thank you for stepping into this frame of truth. If this story moved you, share it forward and help restore the voices time tried to erase. Until the next episode, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep the memory alive.